So before we get into the webinar, a couple of things just to mention. The first thing is, if you're interested in this kind of thing and you're not already on the Search Pilot email list, I highly recommend signing up for it. Essentially, you'll get a free case study every 2 weeks. We'll be covering different topics. Sometimes they are simple SEO experiments like titles and meta descriptions, all the way up through more advanced types of tests like internal linking, full funnel tests, and that kind of thing. So the feedback we've had on this has been great. So if you're not on the list already, feel free to sign up. You can do it at that QR code and or that bit.ly link at the bottom there. The second thing is, if you would like an ideation session like this one for your company, so if you work at a large enterprise brand that's interested in doing SEO testing, I actually run these types of sessions for in-house teams all the time, and I'd be willing to do that for you and your team completely free. So if that's something that you'd be interested in, feel free to drop me an email at craig.bradford@searchpilot.com. Okay, so what we're going to cover today is 4 kind of key areas. We're going to start off with explaining how you actually do SEO testing. We're then going to move on to the ideation part of it. So how do you come up with good ideas? We'll then go through the specific tests for these brands that we're going to be looking at. And then hopefully we'll have some time for a couple of questions at the end. So how do you do testing? Well, the first thing I want to talk about is why can you not just use, or you can't just use your analytics packages, because a lot of people are misinformed or think that they are doing testing by making a change and then looking at the results through their analytics. And the reason why that's hard is it's really difficult to separate out external factors. So imagine you're looking at your organic traffic report in Google Analytics, and so far you have the data up until this point. So you make a change and then you see your traffic falls a couple of weeks after that. Is that good? Is it bad? I mean, it's clearly not good because your traffic's down, but is it necessarily being caused by that change that you made? That's really hard to say, especially when you consider external factors. So if I was to tell you that there was a Google update on this date, does that change your opinion? Maybe it was the thing that you changed, or maybe it was the external factor. Maybe it was a Google update that impacted your traffic. And then what if I also said that this was actually a seasonal event like Thanksgiving? That muddies the water even more. And so it's really difficult to separate out all this information. So that's why you can't just rely on what would be classed as before and after testing. The other area you might look at is, well, why can't we just use rank tracking software or Search Console data? And the reason is sort of similar, but if we look at this website on the left, TUI, you can see that Ahrefs says that they have over 300,000 keywords ranking for that domain. Now, there's nowhere near, that won't be all of their keywords. There'll be many, many more keywords that they will rank for, and you can't track them all. And so if you make a change and just rely on keyword data, there's a chance that you may have increased your rankings or decreased your rankings on a bunch of keywords that you're just not tracking. And so it's not a realistic way to do sensitive and accurate testing. It's good for directional information, but it's not the best way to do it. The same problem applies with Search Console data. This is a fairly recent study from Ahrefs again, who showed that over 50% of the clicks that a website gets are actually hidden in Search Console data. And so it's just not sensitive enough to detect small changes, sometimes as low as 5% or less, when you're relying on data that's incomplete. And so that's why we can't use these third-party tools. I'm not saying you can't use them as well, but they are great tools. This is what we've done up until this point. You know, if you don't have a split testing platform, then certainly use these tools because you don't have any other option, but be aware that they don't control for external factors. So how do we do it? That is what we're going to cover now. And the first thing I'll say is you can't do SEO testing for all websites. there are a few different criteria and things that you should consider. The first one is you need a relatively large website. So you want a site with thousands, tens of thousands, even more pages. And the reason you want that is the way that we do testing is by looking at large groups of pages. We're then going to make the change to only half of those pages and use the other half as a control. And so the more pages you have, the more robust the testing will be. Another common question I get is how much traffic you need. And as a general rule of thumb, we say about 1,000 sessions a day, 30,000 organic sessions a month is about the minimum that you would want to try and run a test on. You can go a little bit less than that. We've got some customers that have been able to test on very, very small sections of the website, but I wouldn't try and do it just on its own. So the first thing you do is look for a large group of pages like this. The example that I've got here is on a flights website. So you can see that although this website has a page for New York and LA and Seattle, the key thing to note here is they all have the same template. So you could essentially just swap out the name. You know, the New York flights page is identical to the LA flights and the Seattle flights, etc. And so that's what we're looking for. We're looking for large group of pages like that. You then have to come up with a thing you want to test. So you need a hypothesis that you believe would increase your traffic if you were to make that change. So in this instance, the hypothesis is that if you were to move the content of this page from the bottom of the flights page to the top of the page, maybe you think that Google would reward the website with value in that content more, and as a result, your organic traffic would increase. The next thing you have to do is decide which pages will remain unchanged and act as your control pages, and then which changes which pages are you going to make the changes to, and those are the variant pages. This process is actually pretty complicated. You can't just do it. You can do it randomly, but you won't get optimal results if you do it randomly. And the reason for that is within any website, there are high traffic pages, low traffic pages, and medium traffic pages. There are seasonal spikes to certain pages, and you have to be able to take all of that into account. The world, unfortunately, just won't stop because you want to run an SEO test. And so the way that Search Pilot works is we actually look at historical traffic patterns to the group of pages that you want to run the test on. And we then use that to create two buckets of pages that are statistically similar to each other. And what I mean by that is they tend to directionally move at the same time. So they tend to go up at the same time, down at the same time. They are impacted by external factors at similar times, and they have a similar level of traffic to each other. So we don't want the control pages in aggregate having 10 million sessions and the variant pages only having 1 million sessions. We want to try and keep the buckets as close to each other as possible. And so Search Pilot does that all for you automatically. And then once you've decided which pages are your variants, in this instance, we've chosen Austin, Boston, and Dallas. Now, also, this is just a basic example. You usually wouldn't test on just 6 pages, per my previous point about needing more pages than that. So instead of 6 pages, imagine this is 600 pages. There would be 300 control and 300 variant. So in this instance, Austin, Boston, and Dallas are the 3 variant pages. And we would use the Search Pilot interface to go in, actually build that change to your page, and then only apply it to the variant. So you notice there, if I just flick between the two, we now have 3 pages on the old template and 3 pages on the new template. And then once you launch that experiment, you can see the gray dotted line here is when the test began. Everything before that point is historical data, and we use that to build a model of what we think the traffic pattern should be like in the future. And that's what this dotted line is that you can see on either side of the start date. We then compare that to the actual traffic. So the solid purple line is the real traffic coming in day by day. And as you can see, there was a sort of period initially after the test began where nothing really changed. And that's because normally Google has to crawl your website and notice that something has changed. And then once they've done that, you can see that actually the variant traffic is outperforming the forecast. And so that would imply that this is a positive change and that you would want to potentially roll this out to the remainder of your website. So hopefully that makes sense. At this point, the number one question that I usually get when I'm explaining SEO testing to people is, isn't this just the same as Optimizely or some other user testing tool? And the short answer, of course, is no. The longer answer is it's a little bit more subtle than that. So there's a few different differences, but the main one is the way that we do the bucketing. So on the left-hand side here, you notice that we have the user testing methodology. So if you want to run a test for users, you make two versions of every single page. So you would have an A and a B of the New York flight page, and an A and a B of the LA flight page, etc., etc. And if 100 people were to go onto the New York flight page, the idea is that 50 of them would see the old version, 50 would see the new version, and then you can run an analysis to say, well, which group of users bought more flights? And hopefully you would find that the variant that you're testing outperformed the original website. That doesn't work for search engines because we can't send 50 Google bots to an A version and 50 Google bots to a B version. There is only one Google bot. And even if we could, we don't want to show two different versions of a page to Google. Otherwise, you might end up with problems around duplicate content, cloaking, all sorts of other issues that could come up. And so that traditional model just doesn't work. And so that's why you can't use user testing tools to do this type of analysis, because it's a different bucketing methodology altogether. So although there's a lot of confusing language, there's a lot of similar language when people talk about A/B testing. The analogy I use is it's a bit like saying, how is a cricket bat different to a baseball bat? They're both bats, but they serve completely different purposes, right? They're not doing the same job. So if you compare that to the SEO testing or method on the right-hand side here, you'll see that there is only one version of every page. So if I was to go to the New York page now, I'm going to see an A version of that page. And if 50 other people were to go to the New York page, 1,000 other people were to go to the New York page, every single person will always see the A version. And crucially, so would Googlebot. However, if we go to the LA page, that's the second page in, that has been designated as a B template, and therefore everyone, including Google, would only see the B version of that page because there is only one version. There's no alternative version. It's as if you'd gone into your CMS and manually changed that page to have a new design. And so we then aggregate all the performance. We look at the performance of the A pages versus the B pages, as well as a bunch of other forecasting and modeling behind the scenes. And that's how we then determine whether or not the new version of the page is better than the old one. So hopefully that answers you. The other couple of things to be aware of is when you compare user testing tools, is that one of the crucial things about SearchPilot is we are a server-side testing tool. And the reason that is so important is we know that Googlebot struggles with client-side testing or client-side changes. And so the whole point, of course, of running these experiments is to find out what Googlebot thinks of these changes. And so if Googlebot can't even see the change, or you can't be certain that Googlebot sees the change, it sort of invalidates the whole experiment before it even begins, because you're essentially running two different tests at the same time. Test number one is, can Googlebot even see the change? And then test number two is the primary hypothesis that you want to run. So SearchPilot is server-side, so we can guarantee that Googlebot actually sees those changes. We can do SEO testing, we can do user testing, and we can actually do full funnel testing, which is where we test both at the same time. But we're not going into that a ton today. We're just going to stick to SEO testing for the time being. All right, so a very quick demo to make this real. It's a very short video just to show you the interface and how it works. This is an example of how you make a change to a website like eBay. So this is the SearchPilot interface on the product pages of eBay. And if you wanted to make a change, you can see that the title tag of the eBay site at the moment is just the name of the product. So it says genuine iPhone cable charger. If we want to make a change to that, it's as simple as going into the Search Pilot platform and making a global rule. So we could change that title instantly. If we refresh the page, you'll see that that has now changed to say Dear Brighton SEO, which is what we made this video for. And it's also pulled in the price from the page as well. So you can see we've dynamically pulled the price in from the content of the site. It's also changed in the HTML. As I mentioned, this is all to do testing. Let's talk quickly about how important this stuff is. One of the sites that we're using for validation today is Jet2. And so I thought I would work through a little example of just how much a 5% drop in traffic would cost Jet2. Now, the reason I've picked Jet2 is they have some of this information public. So I'm not picking on them for any reason other than I could get this information. And their annual report said they did about 1.2 billion in revenue from the whole group. Now, of that, about half of the revenue comes from Jet2 Holidays, which means that Jet2 Holidays is worth about 600 million per year. And if we were to estimate that about 20% of those sales are driven by organic traffic, which I think is pretty fair, then that would mean that if we were to estimate that, again, only 80% of the traffic is non-branded, that means that every single year, the SEO team at Jet2 is influencing about 96 million, or let's just round it up to 100 million per year. So what that means is if Jet2 were to accidentally roll out a change which drops the traffic by 5%, it's worth about 5 million in lost sales per year. So a pretty big deal, and worth a lot of money to the company. And so that's exactly why Search Pilot exists. That's why SEO testing is so critical for large enterprise brands, because it allows you to not only hopefully get winners, but it's also about reducing the downside. A lot of the companies that we work with are some of the biggest companies in the world. And so for them, it's not necessarily about growing their market share by 20%. It's actually about also making sure they never accidentally roll out something that negatively impacts their traffic. And so I love this quote from our CEO, Will Critchlow, who says, sometimes our customers' biggest wins come from never deploying losers rather than from only deploying winners. I think that's just as important for big brands. All right, so let's get into the idea part. The way that I tend to come up with test ideas is to look at sort of 3 different categories. We've got crawling, indexing, and ranking. And then the first 2 I think of as being, can you rank? Do you have the ability to rank? And then the ranking part is, even if you can get in the index, does Google think you're good enough to rank you highly in the search results? So those are the sort of lenses that I look at when I'm trying to come up with ideas. The other thing that I really like to do is visually compare the website that I'm working with against the competitors. And so I really like to use Miro board for this. You can use other tools, of course. But what you can see here is I've got both mobile and desktop next to each other, and then I've marked up all the key parts of the page. So there might be like weather information, there might be hotel information, etc. I find that's an easy way to compare side by side. I then take all that information and I will put it into some sort of table like this. And so you can see that I've sort of broken down both mobile and desktop, as well as some, I mean, I made these up, but core parts of the landing page. So I've got a category of core things. So that is like prices and content and images. I've got informational content, things that I think are related to trust and authority, internal linking, similarities, and then lastly, meta information. And so just from this part alone, it can come up with tons and tons of ideas before doing any further work. I then, one thing to mention is when you're comparing you against your competitors, be sure you're looking at the same page as Googlebot. So one of the ways that you could get confused between your website and your competitors is by thinking you're seeing what Googlebot is seeing, and actually you're not, because there's so much client-side, so many client-side changes on websites now that you might be looking at a completely different page to Google. Now, you can do that easily if it's your website using Search Console, because you can go in and say, I want to fetch my page as Googlebot. But of course, you don't have access to your competitors' Google Search Console. And so one handy tip to make sure you're seeing the same HTML as Google is to use the structured data testing tool to fetch your competitor's page. Then you can be certain you're actually looking at the same HTML as Googlebot. And often you'll find there can be some quite big differences. So once you've come up with a bunch of ideas, the next thing you want to do is prioritize them. So we use this framework at Search Pilot to not only decide how good an idea is, but also to decide what type of analysis we want to use for this test. So on the x-axis, you can see it goes from a weak hypothesis to a strong hypothesis. And then on the y-axis, it goes from an expensive change to a cheap change. And so in an ideal world, we want to be running tests all the time, which are really strong ideas and are really cheap to do. So an example of that might be anything that you've got a case study of, anything that you've seen be positive before, you might consider that a strong hypothesis. And then it's really just down to how much development change that would require as to whether it's an expensive change or a cheap change. Things in this quadrant, so the top right quadrant, we would say you should consider deploying that change as long as it is not trending negative. So although we are a very, very data-driven company, the whole point in Search Pilot is to be able to make data-driven decisions. We also talk about this idea of we are doing business, not science. The tests that we are doing are not medical trials. What we're trying to do is make better business decisions with the information that we have. And so we're not trying to make testing become a barrier. And at the end of the day, we've all got jobs to do. We've got changes that have to be made to the website. And so things which are in the top right, I would say should be things that if you didn't have a tool like Search Pilot, you would do it anyway. And so if you're going to do it anyway, you might have a lower, you might only require a lower confidence level. So rather than waiting for 95% significance, you might decide that you're happy with 80% significance. If you compare that, however, to something in maybe the bottom right quadrant, so something that is a strong idea, but it's very, very expensive to change, it might require a bunch of resources from your engineering team, then you might decide that for that, we want a high or moderate to high level of confidence before you consider that test complete. And so you might decide that you want 95% significance for those changes. And so once we've done the ideation, we tend to think through the ideas in terms of this framework, and that helps us to prioritize, which one should we start with and work our way down the list. Okay, so the ideas that I'm going to run through today are in 4 categories. I've tried to include a range of different test ideas, from very basic ones like metadata to more interesting ones like content changes, internal linking, and structured data. So let's get started. So starting off with metadata test ideas. So this would be titles and meta descriptions. Rather than just show you a bunch of test ideas, I want to teach you how to fish, because title tag tests are one of the most interesting, although they're very, very basic and fast to do. They're some of the most interesting ones we do because they tend to have a high level of variability, meaning they're either positive or negative. They tend not to be inconclusive and in the middle. And that's because they're very front line, right? They're influencing people from the search results. And so a change there can make a big difference to how people click through to your website. So again, the way that I tend to come up with titles and meta description ideas, one way is to look at your competitors. So you can put things into a table like this and compare the different variables that your competitors have in the title. So if we just look at the titles, first of all, one of the things that jumps out to me is that Jet2 and TUI could perhaps test adding price to their titles because they're the only 2 sites that don't have it. And Love Holidays and Travel Supermarket could do the opposite, right? They could test removing price. And it's worth mentioning that this is how a lot of testing goes. No one really knows what Google's going to prefer. So there's a lot of iterative testing, trying things all the way around. And so this is the way that I would potentially look at titles for these brands. The other thing that stands out to me is Travel Supermarket is the only one that doesn't have the year in their title tag. Now, there's not a lot of tests that I would say are consistently positive, but adding year and month to the title is one that I've seen be positive a number of times. I would say it's more positive. It's positive more often than not. And so this is an example here. You can see that the control doesn't have the date in the title, whereas the variant does, and it was a 5% increase. And I would say in travel, this is particularly relevant because every single year, everyone's looking for their 2023 holiday, their 2024 holiday. And so date can be a really nice test to run in this sector. The final one here is removing cheap. So this is where it gets into brand guidelines and tone of voice. I'm not saying that cheap is necessarily a bad thing to have in your title, and from what I can see in Travel Supermarket's messaging, that is what they're going for, right? At the end of the day, they're a price comparison website. And so they are trying to reinforce that they are cheap and the lowest cost. And so this is interesting because it may or may not be helping them. But if they remove this and they see their organic traffic increase because they are the only one that has cheap in their title, then at least they can decide if they want to still have cheap in their title, they're doing it from an informed position, in a brand position, as opposed to an uninformed decision. So that's potentially one to try. On the meta description side, there's a ton of things you can include. So destination, baggage information, transfer information, flight information, tons and tons of different variables. One that stood out to me when I looked at these 4 sites was just how much Love Holidays seem to be going down the trust signal side of things. So if you're not familiar with ATOL, so you notice in the middle of that table there's ATOL, that is sort of a trust signal in the UK for travel agents. Essentially, if you book a holiday through a travel agent and they go bust, you would have some protection around getting your money back and things like that. And so it's interesting that Love Holidays mention ATOL protection, they mention book with confidence, they mention paying securely, and Jet2 and TUI have a couple of those, but Travel Supermarket have none of them. Whereas if you look at the bottom of the list, you can see that Travel Supermarket does seem to focus on keywords like cheap and comparison and savings. So interesting positioning point of view, but again, if you're going to have these things in your meta descriptions, it's really useful if you're doing it from an informed position. And so I think this was quite interesting. Even more ideas when it comes to titles and meta descriptions, you can do it looking at the top 100 results. So this is a graph that I produced from downloading the top 100 results and then looking for patterns in the titles. So what this is showing is that the word best appears in 50% of the top 20 sites, but only in 20% of the bottom 100 sites. And this is for the keyword hotels London, as you can see in the title. Again, another one that jumps out would be star rating. So this only appears in 10% of the top websites, but in 40% at the bottom. And then lastly, luxury appears in 5% of the top 20 sites, but only 50% of the bottom 20. So that's potentially quite interesting. Now, I would say that, if I'm being honest, I think the context here is that the query is quite generic. So you have to think about user intent. When someone types in hotels London, that's a very generic search. And I would imagine luxury and star rating is things which probably skew towards luxury hotels and people that are putting in 5-star luxury hotels. And so it could just be that this is because of the intent of the query. Maybe if the search was best hotels in London or fancy hotels in London, you would see more of star rating and luxury. But still, I think it's interesting to look at these sorts of comparisons. We actually built a tool which is does this really, really quickly for you. It's really easy to do and produces these sorts of charts, and it's completely free. So you can go onto the Search Buyer website. There's this blog post where our CEO Will can actually walk you through how to use the tool, and it'll produce a bunch of hopefully title tag test ideas for you. And when you look at all the different variables, you can see that there's like 20 odd different parameters that you could potentially mix and match. That's where the idea of 8 million test ideas comes from. So there's tons and tons of ideas that you can come up with from just these ones alone. Okay, the next section I want to go into is internal linking. These are a bit more advanced. And so before I get into it, I think it's useful to show you the theory behind internal linking tests, because they're different to normal tests. With a normal test, let's say you want to change the title tag, the page that you are expecting to go up or down in traffic is that page. But with internal linking tests, if you make a change to the number of links on a page, not only can that page change in traffic, but the pages that it is linking to can also be impacted by that. And so the test analysis is a bit more advanced. We first of all do the bucketing in a similar way. So we would bucket based on the category level. So for instance, shoes, skirts, and jeans would be a control page, and any of the products underneath that would also be a control. And likewise, tops, shorts, and swimsuits would be a variant category, and therefore all of the products underneath those categories would also be variants. We then make the change to the page. Now, the pages that we are changing, we call the testing section, because those are the pages that we're actually making the change to. Maybe we're adding links to these pages and we're linking to other pages on the website. The other pages that we're linking to, we call the measurement section, or the first measurement section. And the reason why this is important is often with internal linking tests, you might see that measurement section 1 increases in organic traffic because they've just received a bunch of links, but the original testing section actually decreases in traffic. So how do you know what the answer is? Should you roll that out? Should you roll it back? The answer is by having the second measurement section, which is the overall impact of the two. So you might see the testing section goes up, measurement section 1 goes down, measurement section 2 will give you overall impact of that experiment. So that's how we do internal linking tests. So let's run through a couple of different examples. The first one is testing the visibility of breadcrumbs. Now, as we go through these tests, by the way, down the bottom left of the slide, you'll see I've got little symbols showing which websites the test idea applies to. In this case, it's just Jet2. Because what you see is that on mobile, all of the other brands show the breadcrumb by default, whereas Jet2 has it hidden in a dropdown. Now, in some of our testing, we found that Google won't treat content the same or as valuable if the content is hidden or it requires an action from the user. And given how important breadcrumb links are, I think this is a really good opportunity to test adding the breadcrumb links to the page by default rather than it requiring an action from the user. So yeah, that one's for Jet2. Next up is improving the anchor text. Now, I've seen this be very positive on a lot of different websites. What I mean by this is if you look at the Jet2 example on the top, and I should say, as you see from the key at the bottom left of the slide, this applies to all of the brands. So Jet2, TUI, TravelSupermarket, and Love Holidays could all try this test. So the idea would be to, instead of the breadcrumbs just saying the country or the destination, you'd add in the keyword holidays, or maybe there's another keyword that would make more sense. Now, internal linking is one of the best tools you have at your disposal. We try so hard to get external links, but it's very rare to be able to control the anchor text and the number of links. Internal linking is one of those cases where we can do that. And so I would recommend testing, adding on holidays as opposed to just saying the country. Now, I would recommend starting small with this. So maybe you just start off with one breadcrumb, maybe just try changing Spain. So it would be destinations, Spain holidays, Costa Blanca, Benidorm. And if the Spain result, or I mentioned Spain here, but of course I mean the whole level of country. So if the country pages get a benefit, I would then recommend rolling that out and testing on more pages as opposed to just the one breadcrumb. So yeah. So someone just asked a question, so I'll answer it now. What would be the metric you'd be looking to measure with an anchor text test? So what we'd be looking to measure here is the organic traffic to the Spain holidays page. So remember, on a travel site, you're going to have lots and lots of different countries. You're going to have Spain, Italy, France, etc. And so the test here would be, imagine you've got, I don't know, 100 different countries that you offer holidays to. We would take 50 of those destinations and make them control pages. 50 of them would be variant pages. And then we would change the anchor text on 50 variants to say country holidays. And the hypothesis would be that those countries would increase in organic traffic more than the control pages because of the anchor text that we are that we're answering. That we're updating. So hopefully that makes sense. I'm going to just archive that. The other thing to look at is just the number of internal links. So when I compare the number of internal links which are pointing to these destination pages, 2A by far has a lot more links, with 22,000 links to these destination pages compared to only 9,000 for Love Holidays, 7,000 for Jet2, and 3,500 for Travel Supermarket. For things like changing your breadcrumbs, which I'll go into in a second for another idea, and other forms of internal linking can make a big difference to this. And yeah, if I was any of these other brands, I think there's a lot of scope to increase the number of internal links pointing to those destination pages. One way that you can do that is by increasing the specificity of your breadcrumbs. So I've ordered the companies from highest to lowest in terms of the number of breadcrumbs they actually have. And as you can see, TUI has 6 different breadcrumbs because they go home, destination, Spain, Valencia, Costa Blanca, and then Benidorm, whereas Travel Supermarket is bottom of the table with just holidays, Spain, and then Benidorm. And so they are missing out on a bunch of internal links to Costa Blanca and Valencia. And there's an assumption here, of course, that they have pages for those. Obviously, if they don't do holidays to Costa Blanca, fine. But I'm assuming they do. And so I would recommend following TUI's lead here and trying to increase the number of breadcrumbs you have. And that's drastically going to help with this problem of getting more internal links to your important pages. Next up is my love/hate idea, which is to have some sort of popular links footer. Now, the reason why I love and hate this is because I love it because it usually works. I hate it because it feels like SEO 2011. It feels very old school optimization, old school SEO. And I feel like it shouldn't work in 2023, but from our testing, it usually still does. So this is actually TUI's website, and you can see they've got a huge footer. But actually all of the brands have something like this, except Travel Supermarket, which doesn't have it. So some follow-up tests off the back of this would be, if you have a footer like this, so in TUI's case, this actually isn't shown by default. You have to click the little drop down that you see top right of the image, and that then exposes the rest of these links. However, if, per what I mentioned earlier on, if you were to expose some of these by default, I think Google may treat those links with more authority, and it could help those pages more. I'm not saying you have to have all of the links out, but that's where iterative testing comes in. You could try it with your top 10, then your top 20, and see if there's any trade-off between organic traffic or user behavior. The second thing, which I'd be interested in anyone dropping comments if they know anything about this or they've seen it on other websites, but TUI doesn't do this on their mobile website. They only have a footer on the desktop website, which I found really interesting because if anything, I would have expected it to be the other way around. Now with mobile first and mainly mobile worlds, I would have expected, if anything, they would have had it on the mobile site, but not the desktop. And so I don't know whether this is something that they've done by accident. Maybe they don't mean to not have this footer on their mobile website. But yeah, I'd love to hear if anyone's got any experience of doing exactly that, having it only on the desktop or only on the mobile site, because yeah, I'd be interested in shared experiences from that front. This is an example case study of that, and as you can see, it's far from pretty. And this is obviously just a mock-up, but this was a customer who tested doing this sort of thing, and it increased the traffic to those destination pages by over 5%. So it appears to still be working, even though I don't like it. All right. We have about 15 minutes left, and I think we're just about on schedule. So, content ideas. Before I get into this, a lot of the context that I'm going to be sharing is this idea that visibility of content is really important. And what I mean by that is we've seen a lot of our testing that Google won't always treat content as valuable if it's not shown by default, or if it needs the user to take an action, whether it's in an accordion or a drop down or in tabs or it's hidden. All of these things require action from the user. And yeah, we've seen some tests where having that content shown by default actually benefits the website. So that's where the context is for a lot of these test ideas. This is an example of exactly that from a couple of years ago. This is a supermarket website who had all of the product information in tabs, and they tested moving that information out of the tabs by default, and they saw a 12% increase in organic traffic to those pages. So huge uplift, and yeah, something we've seen time and time again. Of course, there is a trade-off here between usability. Like, you obviously want to make sure you're not negatively impacting conversion rate, and this is something that we would advise running as a full funnel test, where we can measure the impact on users and search engines at the same time. So this one is an example from Travel Supermarket. So they have this content block for their FAQ content. So it's got questions like, is it safe to go to Benidorm? Do I need a visa? But as you can see, all of this content requires the user to click into one of these tabs. And so I would recommend, anytime I see something like this, is one of the things I always like to test straight away, to bring some of that content out by default, particularly because it is being marked up with FAQ markup. And so it's a double benefit there. Hopefully you'll get the benefit from the content, but Google may not even reward you with the FAQ markup unless the content is visible. This is an example of what we just spoke about. So this is Jet2, Travel Supermarket, and Love Holidays. The content that they have on the page, so the generic content about when to go, what to see, all of that information is in some sort of hidden area. So in some cases it's in tabs, some cases it's in drop downs. Again, I would test bringing some of that out. I'm not saying you have to do all of it, but I would iteratively test whether there's any trade-off between having all of it out or small amounts out, and seeing whether we can get more benefit from that content, which is already there. Again, at the top of all of these pages, and you see this on e-commerce websites as well a lot, there is this sort of block of what I call SEO text. Every single one of them has this sort of content at the top. Sorry, I should say, with the exception of TUI. They all have the generic about Benidorm content, but they all have this read more, show more drop down. And so if it's not been shown by default, again, I would test whether or not you're losing out on organic traffic because of that. But it does come with some additional testing. You'd want to test this to find out if there's any impact on user performance as well as SEO performance. bigger content or bigger content idea is thinking about how much content is too much content, and raising this question of, should you consolidate all your content or should you differentiate your content into other pages? And what I mean by this is there was an interview with John Mueller a couple of years ago, I think now, where someone asked him whether or not that sort of classic SEO text is actually beneficial. And what he said was, for websites that have, particularly e-commerce websites, where you might have a category page with just a list of products on it, Google might struggle to understand what that page is about because there's no content on it. It's essentially just a whole page of images. And so he said, having some content on that page is probably beneficial. But if you go too far and you put too much content on it, it could potentially confuse the search engines. And he said, this is something that, you know, the search engines might look at and think, wait, is this an informational page as opposed to a transactional page? And so you don't want to add so much content that you might trick Google into thinking, actually, this isn't a website that you can buy a holiday on. This is a blog or an informational website about these destination pages. And so Google might think to send people there when they want to research Benidorm, but not necessarily to buy a holiday to Benidorm. And so, yeah, that's quite interesting. And it brings me to this next idea that I hinted at a second ago, which is TUI is the only one of the sites that has that content on other pages. So if you click into what to do or things to do or where to eat, any of that type of content on Jet2, Love Holidays or Travel Supermarket, that content is on the Benidorm page. If you do the same thing on TUI, it actually takes you to another page targeted for that keyword. And so TUI is taking the differentiate approach. They're having multiple pages to target longer tail keywords, whereas the other brands are taking this sort of one page to rule them all, hero page to have everything from information about the page to buying holidays, etc. And of course, I don't know which is better, but I would recommend testing both and seeing whether there is any benefit to having this content separate, or whether Google will reward you for having one big authority page on that topic. Travel information on the page. So I really like what Travel Supermarket does here. They have this nice little block that shows what I think is 3 of the most common things that people look for when they're choosing a holiday. What is the language, what's the currency, and how far do I need to fly to get there? And I really like this block, but it's also perfect for FAQ content, which they're not doing this with at the moment. So rather than just having this little block, I would have maybe an FAQ section that is targeting queries like, what is the language in? What is the currency in? What is the flight time to? Because as I said, as a user, I've certainly Googled those things, I've searched those things, and I find it really helpful when that information's there. Travel Supermarket is doing it, the rest of the brands aren't. And yeah, I would recommend that they test that. Similar to that is Love Holidays do have this weather section where they show every single month the average weather in that month, and they have extra information like the number of dry days. But the FAQ questions I find are not the ones I would have picked. I'm not saying these are necessarily bad ones, just that I think they could benefit from having other ones as well. Because when I think about what I search for when I'm thinking about holiday to go on, it's usually what is the hottest month, what is the rainiest month. Those are the questions I want to know. The information is on this page already, but they've not got that question in the list there. And I think this is just a really obvious thing that they could do. None of the other brands have this either. And so easy way to get some FAQ markup on the page and get some content which is useful to users at the same time. The next set of ideas is actually like a subset of content, but they're focused on expertise, authority, and trust. So EAT ideas. The first one is looking at the footer of the website. So as I mentioned earlier, Atoll is this essentially trust authority in the UK, where if you book a holiday with one of these travel agents and they go bust, they offer protection around getting your money back and things like that. Now, as I said, Google in the last few years has made a big push towards caring more about trustworthy websites and authority. And I would imagine that's even more so with the pandemic. There was a lot of people obviously lost money on holidays and trying to get refunds and that type of thing. So in the footer of all of the websites except Travel Supermarket, they have this, I guess what you just class as generic information, but in this case, it's actually really helpful information. It's shown that they have ATOL protection and that they are a member of this other thing called Travel Aware. And although we don't know exactly what goes into Google's measure of EAT, I would guess it's things like this. I would guess that it's weird if you're a travel company and you're not ATOL protected. I would say probably don't trust this company. Now, the interesting thing about Travel Supermarket is they are ATOL protected. They have it on other parts of the site, but they don't have it in the footer. And so I would recommend adding that to the footer because it's one of those things that I can imagine is exactly the type of thing that a machine would learn to expect. And if they're the odd one out, it could be negatively impacting the trust of the site. Similar to that is adding some sort of book with confidence section. So this is Travel Supermarket and Love Holidays. They have this nice little block that shows things that they are ATOL protected, they've got the lowest prices, that they're loved by their customers. And I think this is just another one of those things that makes complete sense from a user testing perspective as well. I'd be surprised if this didn't also help conversion rate, but it probably helps with EAT signals and getting Google to trust the site. So Jet2 and TUI don't do this, and I would recommend that they do. This one's interesting because Love Holidays is the only one that does this. So at the bottom of their pages, they have this little timestamp that shows when the prices were last checked. Now, I've seen in a bunch of other testing for content that freshness is usually a good thing, right? I've seen tests where people change the publication date, and Google thinks that it's a more recent post, and so they give that sort of boost to it. So Google does care about freshness. So I think you might get a benefit from that in this case as well. But I also think it's important from a trust perspective, because if you're trying to compare prices and book a holiday, it's probably pretty good to know that the price is up to date, right? You don't want to see information that's a week old. And so I thought this was quite interesting. It's not something that I've seen on other travel sites. So yeah, definitely worth experimenting with. Again, only Love Holidays. Noticing a bit of a trend here, as I said at the start. Love Holidays seem to have really doubled down on trust. And another way they do this is by showing the reviews of them as a company. So rather than reviews for just the individual hotels, they have this block on their page that shows reviews of Love Holidays as a company. Again, I really like this. I think it's good for users. It probably helps with conversion rate, but I would imagine it's another one of those things that could potentially help with trust signals as well. Last couple of ideas on structured data. Now might be a good time to retest any FAQ schema markup you have. So hat tip to Glenn Gabe on this one, who tweeted about this a couple of days ago, that there was seems to be a big drop in the number of times FAQ is showing up in the search results, mainly on mobile. And that is sort of, you can see it in Rank Ranger charts here as well, showing that it really seems to have dropped off since about 5th of April. So if you have FAQ schema, now might be a time to retest it, make sure that it is shown by default and things like that, to find out if there's anything obvious that you can change. But I also think if you don't have FAQ markup, like Jet2 and TUI, it probably still makes sense to add it. So in this instance, as I said, I think Travel Supermarket and Love Holidays both have it, but Jet2 and TUI don't. So I think for the ones that have it, they should retest it and make sure they still get the benefit. For the ones that don't, I still think it makes sense to test adding it to the page. And there's a bunch of ideas that we spoke about earlier as to how they can get some of that content on the site. And then last one to finish with is something called blemish theory, which I hadn't heard of until recently, but I have used this in tests. I just didn't know that it was backed up by research. And blemish theory is this idea that if you want to find out more, you can read this paper from Stanford. But it's the idea that people will be more favorably disposed to a product when a small dose of negative information is added to an otherwise positive description. So in summary, what that means is, imagine you're looking at a website and they've only got positive reviews. I'm always a little bit suspicious of those companies, right? You think, are they just making those reviews out of themselves? And so what this research actually showed was an experiment where they tested users buying hiking boots. Half the users saw the regular descriptions, the other users saw the same descriptions, but with a small blemish. So a small piece of information that would be considered potentially negative. Now it has to be something small. So it might be something like, this only comes in one color. It's not, you know, the soles of these shoes are going to fall off after 2 weeks. It has to be something which is relatively small. But the research shows that by adding a small blemish, it actually makes people trust the company more, and therefore, hopefully, they're going to buy more product as well. And so I thought this was really interesting, and it's something I've actually seen in the wild. So this is an example from Bloomingdale's, who on their product pages have a little pros and cons section. And I really like this as a user. I'm sure I've seen it on Amazon as well, although I couldn't find an example for this. But I think it's a really nice idea to have pros and cons of something you're trying to sell. In the travel industry, I was thinking this could be done on sort of a destination level. So imagine you're trying to sell Benidorm holidays or Ibiza holidays. You might say that this is great for all of these reasons, but also have a little thing that explains who maybe it's not good for. Maybe it's only good for couples, or maybe it's only good for young people or people that want to go clubbing. Those types of things, in theory, if you say, you know, not suitable for families, are a small blemish. But if you're looking for that type of holiday anyway, it probably isn't going to impact you, but you might trust the company more just by seeing that information. And an added benefit of this is that since August 2022, there's now a pros and cons structured data. And so you can see in the search results here that there is a pro of consistent results. It's still sharp after many uses, but there's a con of no child protection. Now, at the moment, this is only available for editorial product review pages. So you couldn't do this on a holiday page or a product page, but you could do it potentially. I've not tested this yet. You could try it on the level above. So imagine on the Spain page where you have different regions, you might have a little description about why Benidorm's great, and then below it, maybe a small blemish of who maybe it's not suitable for. And it might come with this extra benefit of getting pros and cons in the search results. So hopefully that makes sense. And we're done. We got there. I am 3 minutes over, so I'm sorry for keeping everyone late. I did promise some time at the end for questions, so I'm happy to take a couple of questions, but I'll probably drop off in a couple of minutes. So if you do have any questions, feel free to drop them in Q&A now, and I'll answer a couple. Otherwise, we can wrap up. Someone is asking, am I seeing any trends for independent hotels as far as SEO or marketing goes? Not in particular. I mean, we don't work with many independent hotels. Just the nature of Search Pilot means that we tend to work with very large like comparison websites and companies with lots of different lots and lots of pages. So yeah, I'm sorry, but I actually don't have much experience on that side of things. Someone else has asked how long tests typically take to run. It varies, but on average, a test takes about 3 weeks to run. Normally, you'll see within the first week or so at least the direction, so you see that it is trending up or trending down. And then you can decide whether you want to wait another couple of weeks reach statistical significance, or whether you're happy with just that. As I mentioned earlier, that's when that 2x2 quadrant is really handy, because you can decide whether or not you want to wait to 95%, or whether you're happy with just 90% significance, for instance. Someone asked if I can share the PowerPoint slides. Yes, the recording and the slides will also be sent afterwards. Someone has asked, let's suppose a test proves successful from an SEO perspective, but it has a negative impact on the site's conversion rate. Can that happen? And what would you do? Yes, great question. So I mentioned at the start that with Search Palette, you can do what is called a full funnel test. So anytime, there's obviously a bunch of tests which are invisible to users. So imagine things like structured data. If you add structured data to a website, a user could come book a holiday and they have no idea that you have FAQ markup. So it's invisible to a user. If, however, you're going to add a big block of content to the top of the page, I would recommend you run that as a full funnel test. You can do that with Search Pilot, where we will give you the answer to both. So we can actually say, this increased traffic by 15%, it decreased conversion rate by 4%, the net impact is therefore X. And so that's pretty advanced testing. As far as I'm aware, I only know of Search Pilot that is capable of doing this. You could, of course, do back-to-back tests. So you could run a test with a user testing tool, and then you could run the test for SEO. But yes, you absolutely can see conflicting results. And often you might decide, in fact, there's a case study on the Search Pilot website where we tested an interstitial pop-up. So the marketing team wanted to collect email addresses. That, of course, is good from a brand and a marketing perspective, but actually decrease organic traffic. Now, that might be fine, because you might decide, even though that has decreased your organic traffic by, I think it was 4% was the case study, you might decide that that's worth it because you value the email list more. And so you're absolutely right. This happens all the time, but you're only able to know the true value. That's why we call it full funnel testing, if you can measure the impact on users and search engines at the same time. All right, I am going to wrap up that. If you do have any further questions, feel free to drop me an email. I hope everyone found this really useful. And yeah, I hope to see you all again at some point in the future. Thanks.